Picture this. It's the winter of 1347 in Norfolk, England. Lady Margaret is holding her infant daughter, and she's done everything that a mother in her position could do. She's wrapped this child in wool blankets, fur-lined cloaks. She's even taken off her own hair shirt and wrapped it around the baby. And yet by dawn, she feels that little body growing cold as stone. Now, we sit here in our climate-controlled homes, and we flip a switch when we're cold. Maybe we grab an extra blanket. But can you really imagine, watching your child slowly freeze to death despite everything you're doing to save them? Because that's what we're talking about here. That winter alone, half the children in Norfolk didn't make it to spring. Half. From the fall of Rome in 476 through about 1200. After Christ, winter nights, just the nights, mind you, killed more people than war, plague, and famine combined. Think about that for a second. All those medieval battles we love to talk about, all those dramatic plagues, all those famines. The cold darkness killed more than all of them. And who was fighting this battle? Who was on the front lines of this war against nature? Medieval women. Every single night. The enemy they faced was insidious. It crept through castle walls that we imagine as impregnable fortresses. It slipped through the mud-daubed walls of peasant huts. It didn't care about your social status. It claimed babies from their mothers' arms. It took elderly grandmothers from their beds. And it did it silently, invisibly, relentlessly. Now, in the great halls of 800 after Christ, and when I say great halls, don't picture some grand Gothic cathedral-like space. Picture something more like a very large barn, with better decorations. Entire families slept together like human puzzle pieces, and I mean that literally. They would arrange themselves strategically, fitting together to maximize shared body heat while wolves, actual wolves, howled outside walls that were too thin to stop the killing frost. Here's something fascinating that Saxon women figured out, and they figured it out the hard way through dead children. If you slept with your children between you and your husband, those kids were 3 times more likely to survive the winter than if you followed the old Roman custom of separate nurseries. 3 times. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between a civilization surviving and disappearing. And then we get to 893, and the Countess of Anjou has what seems to us like the world's most obvious idea, but at the time it was revolutionary. She tells her servants to take stones from the dying kitchen fires, wrap them in wool, and place them at the foot of every bed. Boom. Simple. Effective. But here's the thing, and this shows you how every detail mattered. You had to get the temperature exactly right. Too hot, and you'd burn someone or set the bed on fire. Too cool, and you've just wasted precious fuel for nothing. This wasn't just about comfort. This was precision engineering with life or death consequences. Within a single generation, this stone-warming technique spread across all of Francia. That's how desperate people were for solutions. Any innovation that worked spread like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Now, let's talk money. Because staying warm wasn't just about survival, it was about economics. A peasant family in 1100, 1910-7, and remember, peasants made up 90% of the population, would spend 60% of their entire annual grain harvest trading for a single wool blanket. 60%! That's like spending 60% of your annual salary on a single comforter today, and that blanket had to last 10 winters if you were lucky. Meanwhile, noble women had turned warmth into an industry. The Duchess of Burgundy, by 1150, commanded over 3,000 spinners and weavers. 3,000! That's a major corporation by medieval standards, and it was all about producing warmth. These women weren't just managing households. They were running what we'd recognize today as supply chain operations that determined who lived and who died. And then, we get to what I call the warming wars. Because humans being humans, even survival becomes a competition. Rival noble houses started competing to demonstrate who had the best heating techniques. It was like a medieval arms race, but for warmth. This culminated in the legendary winter feast of 1156, where the Countess of Champagne, Offa, and remember this name because this is a flex for the ages, kept her great hall so warm that guests actually removed their cloaks. Indoors, in winter, in medieval France. The other nobles must have thought she was showing off magic. But no, she just burned the equivalent of 3 warhorses worth of cold firewood in a single night. 3 warhorses? That's like burning 3 luxury cars to stay warm for one party. But here's the cosmic joke in all of this. Between 900 and 1300, Europe experienced what we now call the medieval warm period. The climate actually got warmer, winters became milder, and the grandmothers of that era watched in horror as their granddaughters grew soft, forgetting the old ways of banking fires and blessing bed curtains. You don't know what real winter is, they must have said. The same way every generation thinks the next one has it too easy, those grandmothers were right to worry. Because in 1315, the Great Famine arrived, bringing winters so cold that wine froze solid in communion cups. Wine, alcohol, freezing solid, and suddenly, all those forgotten skills, all that ancient wisdom that the younger generation had dismissed as superstition, suddenly it was the only thing standing between survival and extinction. But here's what really gets me. Those medieval women who kept their families alive through those killing winters, they didn't just preserve their own bloodlines, they were literally writing the DNA of future generations. And the tools they used to fight this war against cold, they were about to become incredibly sophisticated. The medieval bed wasn't furniture, it was architecture. It was engineering. It was quite literally a fortress against death. And by 1200, after Christ, women had turned these fortresses into something approaching an art form. Let me paint you a picture of Eleanor of Aquitaine's travelling household. Yes, travelling. This woman moved between England and France regularly, and her entourage included, get this, a master bed builder, 4 curtain hangers, and 20 women whose sole duty, whose only job, was preparing the royal sleeping chamber each night. 20 people. That's a construction crew, not domestic help. The bed itself, and when I say the bed, understand that we're talking about something that cost more than a modest manor house. This thing rose from the floor on massive oak posts that were sometimes as thick as tree trunks. Why? Because you needed to create an air pocket. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. By lifting the bed 3, sometimes 4 feet off the ground, you're already winning half the battle against the cold creeping up from frozen earth. But the real genius was in the curtains. Wool on the outside, lined with linen on the inside, hanging from rails that turned the bed into a room within a room. When you closed those curtains, you weren't just blocking drafts. You were creating a microclimate. The exhaled breath of 2 people could raise the temperature inside those curtains by 5 degrees. 5 degrees! That's the difference between hypothermia and survival. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. In 1308, Isabella of France arrives in England, and she brings with her something that's going to revolutionize castle heating forever. She's got Mediterranean engineers who remember the old Roman hypocaust systems. You know, the ones where Romans heated their floors with underground furnaces? That technology had been lost for 800 years. Lost in quotation marks because it wasn't really lost, it just wasn't in England. Isabella's engineers start carving channels beneath the solar floors, NDAB. And the solar, by the way, was the private chamber where noble women spent their days, strategically positioned to catch maximum sunlight. These channels connected to the kitchen fires, and hot air would circulate through them, warming the stones above. Those stones would then radiate heat all night long. It's basically radiant floor heating, except it's the 14th century. Within Isabella's lifetime, every major castle in England tried to copy her designs. Tried. Most failed miserably because they didn't understand the physics. You needed precise angles for proper airflow. Too steep, and the hot air moves too fast to transfer heat. Too shallow, and it doesn't move at all. The successful installations at Windsor and Westminster became like medieval MIT. People studied them for centuries trying to understand how they worked. But let's talk about the real revolution, the textile revolution happening in Flanders. The master weavers in Ghent, around 1280, developed something incredible: double weaving. They figured out how to create blankets with 2 layers of fabric that trapped air between them. It's the same principle as double-pane windows, except it's the 13th century and it's made of wool. These weren't just blankets. They called them Ghent blankets, and they became so valuable they showed up in peace treaties. Peace treaties? Imagine ending a war and part of the negotiation is, and you have to give us 500 blankets. One master weaver, Marguerite van Eyck, and this is a woman running what we'd found around. Recognized as a multinational corporation, 49, she employed 800 women and controlled warm bedding distribution for 3 kingdoms. 3 kingdoms. Below stairs, in the servants' quarters, there was this whole elaborate dance of survival happening every night. The warming pan, picture a big brass pan with a lid and a long handle, had to be filled with coals at exactly the right time. Too early and the bed gets cold again before anyone gets in it. Too late, and the moisture from the coals creates dampness that invites what they called lung rot, probably pneumonia. Kitchen maids would rise every 2 hours through the night to check the great hall fires. Exactly 3 logs each time, not 2, not 4, 3. They had this down to a science. And here's something beautiful. The position of night watcher, the person who stayed up to tend these fires, was always held by older women past childbearing years. Why? Because they got to sleep nearest the fire, they got extra rations of warming ale, and it was seen as a reward for a lifetime of service. It was social security, medieval style. But perhaps the most innovative approaches came from monastic communities. The Benedictine nuns of Saxony developed something remarkable in their dormitories. Instead of putting beds in rows like soldiers' barracks, they arranged them like spokes on a wheel, all radiating from a central heating source. Genius. Everyone gets equal warmth. Their records from 1173, and these nuns kept meticulous records, show this arrangement cut winter deaths in half. In half! This wasn't just about staying alive anymore. This was about systematically engineering comfort, creating reproducible solutions, building knowledge that could be transferred and improved upon. These women weren't just surviving winter, they were conquering it. Now we're getting into territory that would make your hair stand on end, because medieval women weren't just fighting cold with wool and stone. They were walking a knife's edge between ancient wisdom and what the church called heresy. And that edge? It was sharp enough to get you burned alive. The blessing of the bed straw. Sounds innocent enough, right? Wrong. This was a ritual that went back to time before memory, and it combined Christian prayers with words that no priest would recognize. Words that mothers whispered to daughters in the darkness. Lavender for peaceful sleep, rosemary for remembrance of summer warmth, and mugwort for dreams that would carry you through cold nights to warmer lands. The Church officially condemned these practices in 1212. Officially. But here's the thing about official condemnation. It only works if people stop doing the thing you're condemning. And they didn't stop. Even bishops' mothers, even abbesses in their convents, they kept tucking herbs beneath pillows. Because when your choice is between potential heresy and certain death from cold, you choose potential heresy every single time. Let's talk about the drinks. Before bed, medieval women would consume concoctions that would make a modern FDA inspector faint. Heated ale mixed with butter, actual butter, egg yolk, and ground mustard seeds. It sounds disgusting, but it created internal heat that lasted for hours. The noble women, they'd add ginger from the east, pepper that was worth its weight in silver, cinnamon that cost more than a knight's horse. But the peasant women, they couldn't afford spices from the Silk Road, so they used what grew wild: ground ivy, yarrow, sage. They'd mix these into their ale, creating drinks that didn't just warm the blood, and ID-free, they thickened it. Or at least that's what they believed. And maybe there was something to it, because the recipes that survived all share this same principle. Internal fire fights external frost. Animals. We think about animals providing fur and wool, but that's not even half the story. Great wolfhounds, and these weren't pets, these were working animals, would share the beds of nobles. Their body temperature runs 3 degrees higher than humans. 3 degrees. Plus, their presence was thought to deter evil spirits, which might sound superstitious to us, but if believing your dog protects you from demons helps you sleep better, and sleeping better helps you survive winter, then that belief has survival value. In peasant homes, they brought the animals inside, literally inside, goats and sheep on the lower level, humans above. The animals' body heat would rise through the floorboards, and their breathing, this is crucial, their breathing added moisture to the air. Too dry, and your lungs can't warm the air you breathe properly. Too moist and everything rots. It was a balancing act that required constant adjustment. But here's where it gets dark, really dark. Between 1300 and 1400, hundreds of women were accused of warming witchcraft. Warming witchcraft, their crime, keeping their families too healthy through harsh winters. If your children survived when your neighbors didn't, if your home stayed warm when others froze, you could find yourself facing accusations that could end with you burning at the stake. The trial records of Marjorie Germain in 1441 are chilling, and I don't mean because of the cold. Her crime? She maintained a bedchamber so warm that flowers bloomed on her windowsill. In January, in England, the authorities said it had to be witchcraft. What else could it be? What it actually was, we know from fragments of testimony, was a complex system of reflected heat using polished copper sheets. She had figured out how to capture heat from candles and reflect it around the room, creating convection currents that kept air circulating. It was physics. But physics that worked too well could get you killed, so her knowledge died with her at the stake. The smart women learned to add inefficiencies. They deliberately let heat escape, complain loudly about the cold, shiver in public. Better to be thought incompetent than supernatural. Better to lose some heat than lose your life. Regional variations tell us so much about human ingenuity. In Scandinavia, women perfected what they called the sauna bed. They'd heat their bodies to extreme temperatures, almost to the point of fainting, then wrap themselves in furs that would trap that heat for hours. It's basically using your body as a heat battery. Alpine communities developed communal sleeping houses. Entire villages would gather in a single building, sharing heat, sharing stories, and yes, sharing bloodlines. These arrangements led to what we might delicately call complex family trees, but they also meant survival through winters that could last 6 months. Mediterranean women faced different challenges. Their winters were milder, but dampness was the killer. So they created reversible systems, FU, channels that could carry cool air in summer and warm air in winter. They were basically inventing HVAC systems in the 1300s. All of this knowledge, all of these innovations, they existed in a strange space between the practical and the mystical, the scientific and the spiritual. Women were simultaneously engineers and witches, innovators and heretics. They were saving lives with one hand while risking their own lives with the other. And everything they learned, everything they preserved, was about to become absolutely critical, because the real cold, the killing cold, it was just arriving. The Little Ice Age hit Europe in 1300 like the fist of God, and I mean that literally. That's how contemporary chroniclers described it. The fist of God, punishing humanity for its sins. Rivers that hadn't frozen in living memory became highways of ice. The Baltic Sea froze so solid you could drive wagons from Denmark to Sweden. And in this frozen hell, the only thing standing between European civilization and extinction was the accumulated wisdom of medieval women. During the Great Famine winters of 1315 through 1317, we see a natural experiment in survival. Villages that maintained the old warming traditions, the ones with the herb blessing, wool hoarding, stone-heating grandmothers, they lost maybe 1 person in 10. Tragic, but survivable. Villages that had abandoned these practices, that had gotten soft during the medieval warm period, they lost half their population. Half. The knowledge that had been hoarded in convents, passed down through merchant wives, whispered from mother to daughter, suddenly it was worth more than gold. Literally more than gold, because you can't burn gold to stay warm, and you can't wrap gold around a freezing baby. Then 1348 arrives, and with it comes the Black Death. Now, you'd think the plague would make everything worse, and initially it did. But here's the paradox. Here's the dark gift of mass death. With Preuve-Fleurs, a third of Europe dead, the survivors inherited everything. Suddenly, a peasant family that had never owned more than one blanket now had 5, 10, 20. They could layer bedding in ways that only the richest nobles had been able to before. And the widows, the widows changed everything. When their husbands died, these women inherited guild positions that had been closed to them. No more asking permission from male guild masters to try new techniques. The widow Jeanne Fouquet of Paris, she, remember that name, by 1360, she controlled the bedding supply for all of northern France. All of it, her innovation, quilted bed covers with pockets of air trapped between layers. She saved more lives than every physician of her era combined, and she did it with needle and thread. The architecture of Europe literally changed shape around the need for warmth. The great medieval halls that looked so impressive, impossible to heat efficiently. So they gave way to smaller chambers with lower ceilings. The solar, that sun-catching female-dominated upper room, ISA, became the template for Renaissance domestic architecture. Every proper house had to have one. Chimneys evolved from simple holes that let out smoke to complex engineering marvels with multiple flues, dampers, and heating chambers. Each innovation came from women trying to warm their children's beds without burning down the house. By 1400, the typical English manor house contained heating innovations that Roman emperors would have envied. Romans! The civilization we think of as the peak of ancient engineering, and medieval women had surpassed them. But the real transformation, the one that changed the world, it was economic. The textile industry that grew from medieval warming needs employed 70% of urban women by 1450. 70%! This wasn't cottage industry anymore. This was the foundation of capitalism. The Medici fortune started with wool trading. The Fugger, banking empire, built on textile financing. England's rise to global power, it rode on sheep's backs and women's spinning wheels. The entire economic structure that would eventually fund the Renaissance, pay for the Age of Exploration, and power the Industrial Revolution, AG6, it all started with medieval women trying to keep their families warm. The knowledge networks these women created were revolutionary in ways we're only now beginning to understand. The correspondence between convents about heating techniques, the recipe collections passed between noble houses, the guild records documenting textile innovations, AI, these created information systems that preceded universities in preserving and transmitting knowledge. When printing presses arrived in the 1400s, you know what the first bestsellers were after the Bible? Books of household secrets, basically warming and survival manuals written by women for women. These weren't just recipe books. They were engineering, manuals, medical texts, and economic treatises all rolled into one. Modern archaeologists excavating medieval beds are finding things that blow their minds. Springs made from bent wood that provided comfort and insulation. Adjustable warming chambers built into bed frames that could be opened or closed depending on the season. Ventilation systems that prevented suffocation while maintaining heat. These weren't primitive people huddling in the dark. These were engineers. Museums today display surviving medieval textiles, and textile historians are still trying to figure out how some of them were made. The complexity of the weaving, the sophistication of the layering, the understanding of insulation principles, NDOS, industrial looms, couldn't replicate some of these techniques until the 20th century. The great beds at Hardwick Hall and Courton Court, if you ever get a chance to see them, go. Stand in front of them and realize you're looking at monuments to human ingenuity. Those curtains and canopies aren't just decoration. They're survival technology that would influence architectural design right up to the present day. But here's the ultimate legacy, the one written not in wood and wool but in blood and DNA. Every person of European descent alive today exists because their ancestresses mastered the art of staying warm through medieval winters. The selection pressure was so intense that it actually changed human genetics. Northern populations show cold adaptation genes that were activated during the medieval period. These women didn't just preserve civilization through the cold centuries, they literally shaped the bodies of everyone who came after. Think about that. The next time you flip on your central heating, The next time you pull up a comforter on a cold night, remember that you're the heir to 1,000 years of innovation. Innovation born from desperation, refined through suffering, and preserved through the determination of women who refused to let the cold claim their children. They fought winter with wool and wisdom, with stone and sacrifice. They won, and because they won, we're here. Every single one of us owes our existence to a medieval woman who knew how to stay warm. That's not just history. That's ancestry. That's legacy. That's the story written in every strand of wool, every warming stone, and every drop of blood that flows through your veins from those who survived the frozen medieval nights.